Hi, Whiskey Ringers. I hope you're all well and enjoying the podcast. As always, I welcome any thoughts, suggestions, and feedback you have to make the podcast better, and of course, any suggestions you have for guests you'd like to see. I wanted to share with you a new way to participate in the Whiskey Ring Podcast Bottle Share Club. There are several people who have reached out to me about being put on a waiting list for the top tier. After much thought, I've decided to open that tier up to more people. If you have been hesitating, or if you are a current supporter wanting to level up, reach out to me at david@whiskeyinmyweddingring.com or through social media or Patreon, and I'll be happy to help you move up. I also wanted to send a special thanks to my current $25 a month patrons, who have agreed not only to this change, but who have been truly irreplaceable supporters of this and who make this podcast happen. Thank you to all of you in no particular order. I'm talking to you, Ken, Jesse, Jim, Bill, Don, and John, Yana, Connor, Zach, Scott, Ollie, Steve, and Jake. Without your support, this podcast wouldn't be happening anymore. And thank you for helping me to keep the lights on and keep guests coming to you every week. As always, you could support the podcast for as little as $1 a month, with ad-free episodes starting at $5 a month. This support is the reason the lights stay on, and to make sure the podcast and website are the best they can be. Thank you to all who are already patrons, and I hope to have more listeners join soon. Visit patreon.com/whiskeyinmyweddingring to join today. Without further ado, here's a new episode of the Whiskey Ring Podcast. Hey folks, welcome to a new episode of the Whiskey Ring Podcast. Today we are visiting back to Tennessee. We're going to be going to Memphis, where I have not unfortunately visited in person, but I hope to soon. And with us today is Alex Castle of Old Dominick Distillery in Memphis. So Alex, welcome.
Thanks for having me. And we need to get you to Memphis.
Yes, I would love to go. I've only really been to basically Nashville, Lynchburg axis in Tennessee, so
Yep.
much more to explore for sure.
Yeah.
Um,
So
so,
much more.
so Alex, you are the master distiller now at Old Dominick. Kind of came in as the head distiller, so I would imagine not a ton of responsibilities have kind of changed over the years, but you've got the upgraded title, if you will.
Yes, they upgraded me in about 2019. So after I had been able to get the equipment up and running, had filled I don't even know how many barrels, released some of our products, decided that I'd finally reached a point where we could upgrade the title, as you said. And then in 2020, right before the world shut down, I actually got promoted again to senior vice president.
Nice, very nice. And we should note first, at the time you became the head distiller, you were the first head distiller, female head distiller in Tennessee since Prohibition, as far as we know.
As far as we know, yep.
All right. Um, not that that again, not that it should matter, but it does. So always want to recognize it, of course. So I want to start by going back way before your time in bourbon and in whiskey, I should say, before you're even really supposed to have bourbon and whiskey. And I wanted to start with a story that I've heard you tell, which was your visit to Maker's Mark when I think you were 5 for that. So, I mean, the story itself is well, I'll let you tell the story if you'd like, because I have a question after it.
Yeah, absolutely. So everyone always wants to know what's your first story with bourbon. I am Kentucky born and bred, so I guess it shouldn't be a surprise that I was introduced to it early on, not from a drinking perspective, but from a tour perspective. My parents decided to take my brother and I to Maker's Mark for a distillery tour. As you said, it was about 5 or 6. My brother's 2 years older than me. I think my mom went because of the history of the place. She's a history buff. But I'll never forget watching my dad stick his finger in one of the open top fermenters because they encourage you to do that. And he ate the mash, and I just remember that room stunk. I did not
Mm.
enjoy the smell of it at all. And to see him eating this nasty corn mush in this room, I was like, "You're insane." Well, then it gets even worse because they give me a piece of chocolate, which as a kid, I'm like, "Yay, this is awesome. Y'all have your bourbon. I'm going to have my chocolate." And then I bit into it and it was a freaking bourbon fudge, which as an adult, I love. 5-year-old, not to my liking at all. So my first foray into whiskey was not positive for me at least.
And as I heard the story be told, I kept thinking to myself, yes, Kentucky born and bred, so I get why you might be exposed to bourbon and whiskey at a younger age. But from what I kept hearing too, it was like your neither parent really drank. So,
No.
and bourbon is a big thing in Kentucky, of course, but there's plenty of other stuff to do that doesn't have anything to do with whiskey. Um, and I think in pairing that with the story of how your mom encouraged you to go into chemical engineering specifically for distilling, for beverage alcohol distilling. Um, did you ever ask your mom or both parents, why did we go there in the first place? Why did you convince me to go into distilling when you don't really drink?
I actually have never asked them about Maker's Mark, why they took us. I just know that when we were younger, they tried to expose us to a lot of different things. Like I said, my mom's a history buff, but also they're Kentucky born and bred as well. So even though they didn't necessarily drink bourbon, they did understand the importance of it to our state, to our home. Uh, and distilling it, my mom was just reading articles. So she had read that chemical engineering was, a very reliable degree, kind of an up and coming degree. Uh, Distilling specifically, I have no clue where that came from because even though there were chemical engineers in distilling, I don't feel like it was publicized. So I will have to have that conversation with her now.
So it was, yeah, it seems like there, until this generation, your generation of distillers and brewers for that matter, there was more,
Mhm.
you more people just kind of either had it in the family, they learned on the job, rather than having a formal degree. We are seeing more people with degrees, whether it be from Harriet Watt or UC Davis or University of Kentucky, where they actually have distilling programs now. And
Finally.
finally, yes. So, while you were at UK doing chemical engineering degree, was there any particular focus on beverage alcohol, or was it more on just distillation in general?
So the bulk of chemical engineering, it ran the gamut. There was zero beverage alcohol. I will
Hmm.
say that. I did a lot of material science courses, so plastics and glass, which the glasses come in handy now that I'm having to source glass.
Hmm.
Um, and there was an entire semester on distillation, but it was really like fuel alcohol distillation. Um, to where when I was in school, I'll never forget it. This ended up being one of my favorite professors, but he was also my first professor, and he had us write a 1 page on why we want to be in this program. And I said to make beer, make bourbon, and he didn't think very highly of my goals. He kind of thought it was a waste of a degree, and so there really wasn't a ton of support for people going into the industry at the time, um, which is why I absolutely love the fact that now my alma mater does have not just a program, but an actual distillery on campus.
I'm just curious about this because I know the stereotype of engineering in general. What did your class kind of look like demographically?
So we actually were relatively balanced as far as male to female. Chemical engineering, even then, was somewhat balanced versus like civil engineering or definitely mining engineering, which were all very male heavy. But then, as far as like the racial breakdown, we definitely were just mostly a bunch of white kids.
I mean, look,
It is
call a spade a
it
spade. It
is
is
what it
what it
is at the
is.
time. Yep.
Exactly. Um, yeah. Again, I'm just curious about that mainly because I have family members who are engineers, no one in chemical engineering, but as you said, civil engineering is one of them. And his class was something like 95% male. And this was 60 years ago, but it's still kind
It's still
of,
there. Yeah.
yeah, it's still there. Um, Having had now, 13 going on 14 years in the beverage alcohol industry and distillation industry, do you ever look back on your curriculum and the class you took and think about, All right, this was something that I really could have learned. It sounds like there was maybe a lot if there was nothing on beverage alcohol distillation, but also things that maybe you had to unlearn once you got on the job.
There definitely was a lot you had to unlearn. And this is why universities ask you or encourage you to do like co-ops or internships is you learn the theory, you learn all the stuff in the book. Only a small part of it really is practical in real life. Um, and so you kind of had to unlearn the methods they taught you and learn how to to do real world engineering, which does sometimes involve duct tape. But there was definitely a lot I needed to learn in school, but more so on the like not so much on the distillation side, but more on, something that would be amazing was barrel chemistry. I don't know if that would have fallen in engineering or not, but to learn about that would have been phenomenal going into it, whereas I've pretty much had to learn all about it on the job, like they used to do.
I'm right now. I'm hoping to finish soon Matt Strickland's book on cask management for distillers, and this feels like it could be a great course. It's not a large book, but it in itself could be a course in beverage alcohol distillation, maturation, just how to deal with sourcing wood and making barrels and looking for good ones versus bad ones and the chemistry and engineering behind it.
Absolutely. Yep.
So with when did just before we leave the topic, when did UK put in the distillation? Well, when did they start the distillery there? Let's say.
So the distillery just got their license. I think it was late last year, early this year. They did the grand opening for the distillery itself about a month ago. So it would have been late February, early March.
Wow. So I mean, like you were saying earlier, it's really still taking quite a long time, given where they are and the
But
people
also,
around.
in their defense, they've been working on the distillery for a long time, but to get anything done out of college
Yeah,
in a
that's true.
in a public university, the hoops they had to jump through, the approvals they had to get, I'm sure were obnoxious.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. So you graduate from UK. While you're there, actually, before we go there, while you're there, you mentioned co-ops and doing on the job. So what was your on the job while you were there? Your
I
practical, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I ended up working for a company called Alltech. It was a relatively small, unknown company at the time, based in Nicholasville, Kentucky, which is just outside of Lexington. And I took the job because they had a brewery at the time. But I didn't get the job at the brewery. I was at the engineering office, but my boss was in charge of the brewery. So he let me go down and bottle on Fridays. So that's where I got started, was being knee deep in beer every other Friday. But what I didn't know is they were actually adding a distillery to the brewery at that year, and they had no one to run the stills. And so after getting to polish the stills because they needed to look like shiny pennies all the time,
Mhm.
uh, my boss actually had me come to what was supposed to be observing a distillation, and instead that day I got to run the stills. And ultimately ended up filling the first 100 barrels that would later become Pierce Lyons Reserve and now Town Branch.
Right. So with that, perfect transition into your time at what is now Town Branch and also Wild Turkey. So at Pierce Lyons Reserve, was that the name of the
That's the name it started for the
it
whiskey.
started?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah. Before Town Branch came to be, the malt whiskey they created was named Pierce Lyons Reserve after the founder, Dr. Lyon.
gotcha. So I'm curious between the two of learning from Dr. Pierce Lyons and then learning from Jimmy and Eddie Russell, the differences in teaching styles that you saw and what you learned from each of them.
So I was fortunate actually at Town Branch Alltech. They actually brought over a retired distiller from Scotland, and that's who I learned from originally. I spent 2 weeks with a man named Harry Coburn. Um,
Oh
and
yeah, I
to
know
give you
Harry
an idea
Cooper.
of his Yeah, everyone knows Harry. That
Well,
he's
I've
the
heard
one
the
that
name.
taught
I haven't
me.
met him in person. Let's put it that way, but I know the name.
Oh,
Yeah.
you need to meet him. He's amazing. But to give you an idea of his teaching style, one of the the first things he taught me, we were heating up the wash still because it was all pot distillation, and he we're standing next to him. He says, "Do you know how to tell when it's ready? Like when it's going to start boiling over?" And I said, "No, I've never done this before." And I swear he just puts his hand on the pot still. And he's like, "You find where it's hot." I was like, "Yeah." And then you burn yourself. He said, "You get really good at being fast and you build your reflexes." So that was his teaching style. But no, learned an amazing amount from Harry. It's all very, very hands-on, but not overly technical. It wasn't, talking about boiling points or anything like that. It was knowing your equipment, knowing where the heat is, um, and just being able to taste it and know what to do. And then fast forward to Wild Turkey, I was fortunate not to just have Jimmy and Eddie to learn from, but the rest of the staff. My direct boss was head of production, and he had been with Seagram's before, had spent some time over in Europe. I mean, a massive knowledge from him, plus my production staff. I had the most senior employees. They'd all been at Wild Turkey for 40 years. So I also had the benefit of learning from them. Um, and so you can imagine the variety of teaching styles I was being exposed to at Wild Turkey. Um, my boss tended to be a little more technical. And so we definitely talked about the, different types of pumps, different boiling points, this, that, and the other. Whereas Jimmy definitely was more how it tastes and how, here's what we've always done. Um, and then my production staff could tell you by looking at the screen, because it was all automated by this point. "Well, do you see how that number's changing?" He said, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, it means this." And, "Oh, that number's not right. Let's fix it." And they knew how to fix it. And so it was learning the practicalities from them.
With Harry Coburn, having a Scotch whiskey maker, some like you said, legendary in the industry, come over and teach you here about how to produce. Well, it was Pierce Lyons Reserve. It was a bourbon, right?
So it actually started off as a malt whiskey.
It did. Okay. So I was going to say, was there, a bridge to cross in a Scotsman teaching you to make bourbon, but if it was a malt, that makes a lot more sense. No bridge needed to cross there. Um, I guess when you went between the two as well, how either difficult or challenging was it to transition from making the malt whiskey to a bourbon corn-based distillate instead?
For me, the biggest challenge was just the change in equipment, in the process. So Pierce Lyons Reserve Town Branch, two pot stills, batch distillation, moving. And I also had brewers. I didn't even touch the mashing side. The brewers did all that for me, um, which wasn't very different for them. That's why they did a malt whiskeys, because they were already making beer. Um, and then Wild Turkey, you had, of course, the different grains that were not just malt, but it was a column still, and it was continuous operation. It was no longer batch. And so for me, it was wrapping my head around just how different those systems are. Trying to start up a pot still versus starting up a column still, two very different things. A pot still is basically a giant pot of water that you're waiting to boil.
Right.
Column still, not so much. So for me, that's where the transition came from. And then after that was learning more just the flavor of the distillate, because of course it's going to taste very, very different with that corn content than a malt whiskey would.
So with that, the last question I have on this era, if you will, was one of your other responsibilities at Wild Turkey was overseeing, grain when the grain came in, grain quality. Wild Turkey is famous for their saying of Gucci corn, best corn possible. And there's it's a story. I'm talking with my hands a lot, which is ridiculous because it's an audio podcast. But there's a perception, I think, of if one kernel of corn is off in this truckload of corn, the whole thing goes back. And um, obviously, mustiness is different. Like if you smell must through it, then you got to dump it. But how often did it actually happen that batches were returned to the source?
So while I was there, and I don't know if this is still the case, but while I was there, we got our corn from one supplier, and that grain elevator, they worked with the farms, and they were so good. They would, because we also use non-GMO corn exclusively. And so the people we bought from would inspect the trucks and also test it for non-GMO. They would test it when it came in before it went into their elevator, their silo. They would test it as it was going into the truck to come to us. And then they would test it one more time before sending it to us. So they already triple check it for us. And then we check it ourselves. So in the 4 years I was there, I never had to reject a single load from them.
Wow. So the story is maybe more kind of apocryphal than reality.
Yeah, and who knows, by the time I was there, the technology for testing, all the quality control was just so much better. Whereas who knows if you're talking 20, 30, 40 years ago, it probably wasn't as consistent. And also, I was at Wild Turkey when that facility was brand new. So we also had super clean equipment, brand new equipment. We emptied the silos every year, had people come in professionally clean it, spray it. So that also helps it because sometimes that bad kernel may not be bad when it comes in. Something happens to it in your system.
Right.
So that also could be something that, happens to a distillery.
And so with that, move on to the transition to Old Dominick and where you are now. One thing I wasn't quite sure of, and I kind of heard two different things on this. I heard that you were basically got a cold outreach through LinkedIn for someone looking for a distiller. But in one interview, I'm trying to look quickly at which one it was because it was on Our American Stories. Um, you said that quote, I had nothing better to do, so I moved to Memphis. So I was just curious on the timing. Like, did you go directly from Wild Turkey to Old Dominick? Did you take a break in between?
I went directly from Wild Turkey to Memphis. And it was a cold call with someone reaching out on LinkedIn that was a recruiter. So that is absolutely accurate. Um, and in some ways, I didn't have anything better to do. I loved Wild Turkey. I had no intention of leaving, but why not take the risk? Why not move to Memphis, a place I had never been before, and help start up this distillery?
At the same time, you said you're not a huge fan of the startup mentality. Like you like having things set up and good. So it
I
seems to go
do.
against type that you would do that.
It very much is. I like being comfortable. I like knowing what the day to day is. Although at Wild Turkey didn't always know. Production throws you curveballs. Um, but it was when it was presented to me, I realized how much I liked the idea of the challenge. Um, being at Wild Turkey, I didn't, of course, now they're building a new facility, but didn't see ever helping start anything new at Wild Turkey. It was just always kind of going to be the status quo. And when the opportunity presented itself, I realized, well, crap, maybe I do want to try this and see how it goes. Worst case scenario, it doesn't work out and I move back to Kentucky. And fortunately here we are 8.5 years later and I'm still in Memphis.
It's true to be fair to you and to people who are at some of these larger distilleries like Wild Turkey. When you've got that familial kind of dynasty going throughout, for better or worse, it means you have continuity. It means you've got a good perspective into the future. But at the same time, for people like you, it means that you may not have a chance to break into certain roles there.
Absolutely.
I think about too, like Jerry Dalton at Beam being in between Booker and Freddie, Booker and Fred, And I'm like, he doesn't get talked about enough. He's there for 12, 13 years
Yep.
as the head there. And, but it's always, no, it was beam, 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 or no, 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 all the way down.
Yep.
Um, so I could see, like, even for someone who, like you said, wants to be comfortable, know what the day to day is, the opportunity to put your stamp on something would be pretty attractive. So, um, with that, I'd love to know a little bit more about what the pitch was like. How did um, I'm blanking on the husband's name at the moment. I know Alex is the wife. I'm totally blanking on the name. But how did they pitch to you? Okay, this is what we want you to do.
Well, so first, the way it was from the headhunter was just there's this family company wanting to start up a distillery, and they need someone to help do it with experience. Um, and really, the pitch from the family was just we're a 150-year-old company. This is our family brand that's been dormant since Prohibition, and felt it was time to get back to Memphis, bring it back. And we want to be a world-class whiskey distillery. I was like, okay. They really did not have to work very hard to get me to say yes. And it's also it's fair. It took a couple months, but came down for my interview, and the timing of it was kind of perfect because it ended up being Memphis in May, and it was the World Championship barbecue competition. And they actually took me down to the river, so I got to experience that. And if you've never seen Barbecue Fest, you have to experience it at some point because it's just hundreds of tents, 2, 3 stories tall. Smells amazing. But got to experience that. Also got to go to a Grizzlies game. It was game 6 against Golden State. So the energy was insane. So they really showed me Memphis and Memphis at its best. And so more than anything, I think my husband and I fell in love with Memphis and decided it was let's take the leap just so we can experience the city.
I do have to say, every time I visit Kentucky, Tennessee, that whole area, we have a lot of good food up here in New York, but barbecue is just one of those that there's not something up here that compares. Um,
No,
it's just
you can
not.
try.
Yeah, I'll fully admit it. Uh, there are just some things you can't do, and I get it. I mean, there's not a lot of space to put a smoker around here, but you'd think someone might do it, but it's just not the same. There's some commercial barbecue places, but nothing like you find at a barbecue fest where you've got
Yep.
tents among tents of different types. So I do I do eat my fill of that whenever I go down, just to make sure. That, and if it's Tennessee, I also got to do the hot chicken. Um,
Of course,
yeah,
absolutely.
but um, actually, I'll put you on the spot. What's your favorite hot chicken?
So our what we prefer, it's not even technically hot chicken, but in Memphis we have Gus's fried chicken.
Hmm.
And so it's not there's no additional seasoning on the batter. It's not dipped in any sauces, but the seasons, the spices are in the actual batter to where it has some heat to it. And it is some of the best freaking fried chicken you will ever have.
It'll be on my list when I do that. I always come back, a few pounds heavier, both in body and in luggage. So, you know,
Absolutely.
all for good reasons. So moving to Old Dominick, you said it's a family company founded in 1866, had a whiskey component for many years, pretty much since either near the founding or close to it,
Yep.
until Prohibition killed it off, as it did with
Yep.
so many other distilleries and blending houses. What was the Old Dominick brand originally more of like their own distillery, or is it more a blending house?
It was more a blending house. From what we can tell, there was no physical distillery, but we actually have receipts from Kentucky. There's a distillery in Cincinnati. We have a receipt from barrels, and they would bring them down to Memphis on the rail. And they had a building not too far from where the distillery is today. where they would offload the barrels, and that's where they would then dump the barrels blend and bottle it under the Old Dominick brand.
And with the Old Dominick brand being dormant since, let's say it would be Tennessee's prohibition, so 1909.
Yep.
So 10 years before national prohibition. That's 100 plus years, 104 years, I guess,
Yes.
until. So was there, did you have to resuscitate the copyright or the trademark in doing so?
Fortunately, no one had even tried to use it, so we didn't have any battles. We did have to secure the trademark for it, and the copyright for it. But like I said, we didn't have to like go after anyone or try to get it back to the family. It was a brand that just truly was lost to history.
I guess in a way that was kind of aided by Tennessee going literally 100 years without allowing for distillation in most counties.
100%.
Yeah. So this is actually a good point to plug a mutual friend's recent work, Drew Hanisch over at Whiskey Lore, his new book on Tennessee whiskey. Really excellent scholarship in there, and I know Old Dominick is in there. I know the history of distilling in many areas of Tennessee is in there, and most of all, this is the most positive thing I can say about it is that it is a book where not all the information that's out there is in the book. It's very much filling a niche and filling a void that had not been filled for Tennessee whiskey in particular.
Yep.
And as such, it is a great jumping off point for much more scholarship and research to come. And I hope that that's what it is remembered for. So with that being said, jumping back to Old Dominick and Canale, the parent company, the other thing I was thinking about was Memphis is basically as West Tennessee as you can get.
Yes.
We're right along the river, across from Arkansas, and you're on the Mississippi at that point. It's all the northern rivers have converged, so it's truly the Mississippi at that point. So the history of Western Tennessee is more awash with legal distillation, whereas Eastern Tennessee more rural, more rugged, more illicit distillation, more moonshining. So that moonshine tradition really comes through in NASCAR, and all that comes from more Eastern. So I guess thinking back to around like 2009, I know you were still in college at that point. You weren't yet at in distillation, but I'm curious if you've heard stories of what that transition was like from basically you can distill if you're Jack, George, or Pritchard's, and suddenly in 2009, no, you can distill. And what that transition was like, and I don't know if you know this, what it might have looked like differently in Western versus Eastern Tennessee.
So yeah, like you said, I wasn't even in Tennessee when all of that happened, but through my activities with the Tennessee Distillers Guild, have been able to kind of glean what it was like. And really, it was that effort that formed the Distillers Guild. It was a group of people who wanted to get into distilling. They wanted to do craft distilling, and so they joined forces to change the legislation and make it legal. Basically, it was almost across the entire state, but essentially they did it in such a way that it became legal anywhere that allowed for the sale of alcohol, so wet counties, which is most of the state.
Hmm.
And it wasn't long before people started working on their distilleries, maybe a little while before people opened up. But I remember Corsair. I lived in Bowling Green, Kentucky, right after they opened their Kentucky facility because they needed to get producing, and the laws in Tennessee hadn't changed yet. So they moved into Kentucky to start that process. But definitely, I think East Tennessee was one of the first to really take off, largely because of Old Smoky.
Mm-hmm.
That was one of the first distilleries to come online, and of course, did moonshine. Got moonshine on the map in that regard. But from there, it just flourished. It blew up. and more so in East Tennessee and then also Middle Tennessee. Uh, West Tennessee, we still to this day do not have a ton of distilleries over here. There is, of course, Old Dominick in Memphis. We also have Blue Note, who's more of a blending house here in Memphis. And then there's Samuel T. Bryant in Jackson. And that's pretty much all we have in West Tennessee. Whereas I'm pretty sure there's more distilleries than that on the main strip in Gatlinburg.
Right. It's kind of amazing when you look at the map of what the distilleries most likely look like up until state prohibition, and then what it looks like today. And it's a whole shift over. It's like someone flipped the state on a 180, or I guess
Yes.
on a vertical axis. Something. It's mind-boggling, and I think today, well, I guess back in late 1800s, early 1900s, the transportation networks were a little less developed than they are now. So it was a lot of river
Yes.
transport, a lot of rail,
Yep.
and it's still that today. But because there are so many other options, it doesn't mean they don't have to be on the river anymore in order
Yes.
to
Yes. You don't have to
get
be as
things.
focused. Yep.
Exactly. So when we get to 2013, the family wants to rejuvenate the brand, revive it. Was Have you talked to them about their thinking at the time? Was it part of the Tennessee distilling boom, and they just like, we have this back there? Was it kind of more something that was forgotten as part of the history, and they just discovered it and were like, oh, we want to do this again? Uh, what was really that driving factor?
So my understanding of how it kind of came about is um, they still have a lot of the old artifacts from not just Old Dominick, but all of their different business ventures. And in the family office, they have a conference room, and they had Old Dominick bottles empty, sitting on shelves. So the family, the current president and everything, was fully aware of Old Dominick, but I don't think he thought anything of it. But they had someone come in for a meeting. I think it may have been someone from a bank or something. And he saw the bottles and he said, you know, you could sell those because, craft is starting to take off. You could sell that brand.
Mhm.
Someone will buy it. Everyone wants a story. And that got the president, who's the fifth generation owner, thinking. He's like, I'm not selling. I'm bringing it back. Because also at that point, the family company was no longer really, other than having an office in Memphis, really had no presence in Memphis. Everything else was out of the city, out of the state, where it was just investments. There was no true Memphis based business anymore. And he wanted to get back to what the family used to be, where it really was a Memphis company. So between, having someone plant the seed of, ooh, you might have something with this brand, and two, I need to get my family's company back to Memphis. That's really kind of what did it for him.
Was this before or after the parent company? Because I think the parent company was acquired at a certain point.
The
Um,
parent company has always been
yeah,
family owned, Canale Company.
it's still family owned. Okay.
Yep.
Um, then that cuts out that line of thinking because I
Yes, they've always
okay.
had full ownership of the company. They have bought other ventures and also sold off ventures for. So when the company first started, they were very much wholesale food and fruit distributorship, and that continued through Prohibition. They still had food up until 1999. They sold that off. They did a Budweiser distributorship for, I believe, close to 80 years. Sold that off in 2010. So really, that was one of the last Memphis-based public entities they had. And so it was almost kind of replacing that distributorship is what Old Dominick kind of did for the company.
Gotcha. I think that's what I was thinking. It was when
Yep.
the last piece was sold off in Memphis.
Yep.
So in reviving the brand, you've already said there are records, there are log books, price books. empty bottles of the Old Dominick brand. One of the things I was kind of surprised. Oh, and of course we had the bottle of the toddy
Yeah.
as well. One of the things I think that was most curious to me was that when you have a long-standing company, uh, good records, from what it sounds like, pretty solid histories, and but yet something that's missing is there's no kind of whiskey recipe from the time. And it seems odd to me because I would think that would be something that would be written down. I get if it's not, if you're not distilling it, if it's more of a blending house and it's more about what you're bringing in or what's
Able
available
to
to you.
get. Yep.
Right. But yeah, were there any kind of uh, instructions, less for the lack of a better term, as to what they were blending beyond just knowing that they came from Cincinnati and other areas?
Not that we have found. Um, Now, there could be books that maybe we haven't actually gone through yet. Um, but from what I've seen, we have not found anything to actually indicate, other than those receipts, what went into any of the bottles. The toddy you mentioned was something that they did in-house. They, bought the bourbon base, but they actually infused it with botanical spices. Um, and there is no recipe for that whatsoever.
Right. It, again, it's just fascinating to me. It's it feels like it
I think
should
it's
be there, but
hysterical.
yeah,
There's because we have ledger books for decades, and you can tell they were so detailed, and we can't
right,
find a freaking recipe to save our lives.
right. Even just something maybe this is probably something Drew would find a newspaper ad or something just saying what the flavor profile was that you were looking for. Was it
Yeah.
consistent blend? Was it when you're at the mercy of whatever you can get? I don't know how consistent a blend you're able to make, but something like that just to give an indication of what it would have
Mhm.
been like
Yep.
115 years ago or something. But anyway, we uh, we must mourn and move on from that. Hopefully, it'll be found one day. So when the brand is being revived, 2013, 14, 15, you came on in 2015. The before you came on, the decision was made. We were going to build a distillery, but in the meantime, we got to get some liquid to start selling, get revenue, start driving this thing forward. And that resulted in something we really don't see anymore nowadays, which was a contract distillation with MGP,
Yep.
which we think of a lot of brands coming from MGP, but the reality is that many of them it's MGP mash bills, and people buy it either as new maker, as aged spirit, and it's pretty much chosen for you. MGP doesn't really do contract distillation anymore. It's moved to places like Bardstown Bourbon Company, Green River,
Yep.
uh, and even then, it's getting harder and harder to find places that will take your yeast, your recipe, your mash bill, all of that. So with I we should state from the beginning that the MGP that it's not that we shouldn't think about it as MGP juice because it's yes it's made there but it's your recipe. It's Old Dominick's
It
recipe.
was 100%
Um,
custom. Yep.
exactly. But to separate it from Old Dominick, which is brand wise, Old Dominick is uh, distilled, aged, bottled in Kentucky, in Tennessee. Sorry, uh, the liquid that came from MGP was bottled under the Huling Station line. And first thing I got to ask is that contract distillation contract still active?
So it could be if we wanted it to be. But full disclosure, minimum order quantities have definitely gone up to I think it's like 5 years supply for us or something like that.
Wow.
Um, and of course, pricing and everything has gone up too. So for right now, and also trying to get on the schedule. I think we were like 18 months out last time we talked to him. And so it's getting more difficult to even get in the queue, to where for right now we have plenty of inventory aging from MGP. We've kind of pushed pause on the contract, and just focusing on our Memphis produced while we decide what happens in the long term, with that Huling Station.
And based on the way you were aging the spirits too, a minimum of 4 years, really closer to five, with some going higher, between an 18-month wait to get on the schedule plus the maturation, you're looking at 6.5 to 7 years before the liquid's being sold. And yeah, I think if you've got the stock, it would make sense to just pause on that and be like, all right, maybe we'll come back to this later.
Yeah, exactly.
So with the um, when stock was being made, and say, did you take it as a new make and then age it in Tennessee, or was it aged in Indiana, or
It
both?
actually was all aged in Indiana. We did have from our first run about 100 barrels randomly got aged in Kentucky. Um, just from a warehousing perspective, we had to store them somewhere else. But all of those barrels have done the majority of their life in Indiana, typically only spend maybe a year in Memphis before we dump them.
And I guess the other question then naturally that comes up is the custom weird mash bills that you have, that are very unusual. The bourbon mash bill that you use, 75 13 12, that one is more, we know places that use that mash bill. It's more um, common, let's say, in the ratios. But the high rye bourbon, I guess the two that I want to call out, the high rye bourbon. So you've got a 52% corn, 44% rye, 4% malted barley, and then an 83% wheat whiskey, which I think 16% corn, 1% malted barley in there.
12% corn,
12% corn,
5, 5%
5%.
malted. Yep.
So I know this was, again, before your time there, but do we know how those mash bills came about?
So they set about trying to figure out how to stand out on the shelf. Because again, they saw what was happening in the market. They knew the market was being flooded with things. And so they're trying to sell a bourbon with a Tennessee distillery on it. We have to figure out how to do it. And so they wanted something unique. And the mash bill is one of the easiest ways to do that. Um, and so they decided, let's go high rye. And they went high rye. Um, and I love it because it can appeal to a rye whiskey drinker. It's not really a rye, but it's high enough rye you can enjoy it. And then the wheat, again, think about 2013, 2014 when they're starting the conversations within GP. What did the wheat whiskey category look like? It was like one brand,
Right. It's
maybe two.
Bernheim. That's
Yeah.
it.
um, and so again, it was one of those, and it was a risky move because even to this day, that category is still not huge. But they decided, like, okay, well, no one's in that space. Let's take a chance and play in that space. And so it was just through taste tests that they decided they didn't want 100% wheat. It just didn't have enough to it, and they discovered that having just 12% corn gave it a lot of body, a lot of complexity, and a nice mouth feel that it just with wheat whiskey tends to lack when it's 100% wheat.
Yeah, it's a category that has a lot of potential to explore different wheats, and explore the 100% wheat, as you were saying, versus a mixed mash bill. But yeah, still underrepresented by far. Bernheim's
Very
still
much
the
so.
overwhelming category leader in that space. Um, but it is good to see companies like Huling Station, like Traverse City is another one that puts out a great wheat whiskey, and got to throw Frey Ranch in there as well. But still, there's so few that it's actually a category you could go through in a couple of days. You've decided to
Yes.
get a bottle from each and taste them, compare them. It's different styles. So anyway, the one category though that I haven't seen yet, from either Huling Station or Old Dominick, is a rye. And I should actually add, I also not an American single malt, but uh, so let's put those together. Any plans to make either one of those?
So rye, most likely not, because with the high rye bourbon, to make them distinct, because that's also how we ended up with the mash bills we did, is we wanted each one to be so different from the others that they could stand on their own. to do a rye whiskey that is different enough from the high rye bourbon, I couldn't do 51% corn or 51% rye. I would have to go 95% rye.
Mm.
I really would. And from my time at Wild Turkey, I learned how awful a super high rye mash bill can be to run from a manufacturing standpoint. It's thick, it foams. If you have to treat it as, in the dry house, it gums up. So I really don't want to deal with it from a production standpoint. But I also just, if I'm going to do a 95% rye, there's already a very well known distillery that does a 95% rye that people love.
Yep.
Am I really, am I really going to try and compete with that?
So that's
And then, you know, and then the malt whiskey, um, honestly, probably coming down the pipeline at some point. Um, but we already make 3 mash bills in house and only have so much production capacity to where if I add a 4th mash bill or a 5th, if I were to do rye, that's that much less whiskey I can make in our current facility. So I think if we ever get to a point where there's another bigger facility that can crank out our cores, we probably could experiment a little bit more with those other mash bills.
fair enough. So as you're moving from Huling Station more to Old Dominick, as from a brand perspective, being the main brand of the distillery, Huling Station is not going away. As you said, there's plenty of stock. You've got some older stock too, some 9-year-old that's now out of the market. Is the idea to basically keep up that line as long as you can, given the stock, and then kind of decide at that point whether or not to retire it?
We're having those conversations now, actually, trying to decide how long do we let it live out. Because I do think there's a shift out in the market where people are favoring product that is made in-house. People are understanding contract versus actually produced by the distillery. And there does seem to be a lean towards wanting it to be produced at the distillery. So we're kind of trying to watch the trends, see the sales, and make a decision on what the timeline for Huling is. So conversations are still happening at this point.
And as they at the moment, the Huling line is still has the core expressions out, but you also have the trolley stop line, which are some of the more experimental one-off releases that I haven't gotten to try them, but they look quite interesting. Looking into them. So
yeah, those were fun to craft. I was able to use our oldest vintages, which was the 2014 production run, which is why we were able to put the 9 years on it. And those were fun because I got to blend without having to worry about the flavor profile. I wasn't trying to match anything. And we did it to where it was 2 bourbons and 2 wheats. And we did 1 bourbon and 1 wheat at 95 proof, and then 1 of each at cask strength. And I did that with the idea of, for the consumer, it gives you the chance to try 2 mash bills at the same proof. Basically, everything's the same age, same barrels, probably similar locations in warehouses, all that type of stuff, same proof. And you could understand what high rye is versus a wheat. And then same thing with the cask. You could do the 95 wheat with the cask wheat. And for the consumer, especially if you're kind of new to it, really sit down and see what proof can do. Mm-hmm. And that maybe high proof is better, maybe low proof is better, or maybe they're both equally good. And it can open your eyes to that possibility.
And then, of course, moving into in-house, the Old Dominick. So when you came on, I'm curious what pieces of equipment were kind of there already, and what you got to build in to your design.
So all of the big equipment had been ordered because they were working with Vendome, and of course, Vendome, you need to start that process early on. Even back then you had to. So everything was designed, but when I came on board, the building the distilleries in was completely empty. We had nothing on site. So I got to jump in and help finish the layouts. I was there to determine pipe layout, pipe routes, bottling line was 100% my selection. They didn't have any of that yet, so I got to build out the bottling line. I got to handle the granary. None of that had really been done or started because the lead times on that was they were lower. Um, so yeah, it was a nice mix of already having some stuff done for me, so I wasn't having to come in and just do it all, but also still a lot that I got to be very hands on and
The some of the equipment, such as the stills in particular, were ordered before you came online. Was there anyone kind of advising the family on which stills you wanted?
but thankfully, the family is not stupid. They're very smart. That's why they've been around that long, right? And
Mhm.
so they, right out of the gate, had hired a consulting group who also then had them bring on a distillery engineer, Pete Kamer, um, who's very well known in the industry as well. He's worked on I don't know how many distilleries at this point. And so it was Pete who actually helped come up with all of the equipment selection. So when I heard that he was doing that, I really didn't. I was like, okay, I'll trust you, Pete.
It's an interesting thing to do because you, you have the contract distilled liquid from MGP that's aging in Indiana and with time in Memphis at the end, and then you're building a new distillery to make your own in-house liquid and using the same mash bills. So, I mean, you know that it's not going to be the exact same. You can't replicate the MGP just size alone. It's not going to happen.
100%.
So too many things are going to be different. But in in doing that transition where you're building a distillery, but you want to keep the mash bills the same, I'm I would love to delve into what that thought process is like of figuring out what what to mirror, what to mimic, how to change a still design. I mean, how do you do that if you want to stay faithful to what the flavor profile is that you've created?
So what was awesome when I came on board is, yeah, the original idea was all the MGP juice would go under Old Dominick. And as our stuff came online, it would transition to, we'd start blending the two, and then eventually it'd all be Memphis produced. Um, and when I came on board, they decided if we didn't want to do that, we didn't have to. So that's why Huling Station came into existence. So starting to produce those same mash bills in Memphis, I was able to just make the production calls that I wanted. So we're distilling to a different proof in Memphis than we did in MGP. We're doing barrel entry at a different proof than we did at MGP. Um, and we're also discovering Memphis heat and humidity is definitely causing them to age very differently than they do in Indiana. Um, so truthfully, I ended up tackling it with the idea of, yes, they're the same mash bill. I'm not trying to get them to be the same.
And that, of course, will also allow Huling Station to be its own line. No
Yep.
pun intended. Be the same mash bill, but it's an exemplar of okay. These are you could put them side by side in a tasting and say this is what happens when you distill there versus here, age there versus here. Uh, yeah, that sounds like fun. I like doing side by sides of different things, and to that end, just to get into the products that were shared with me that I got to taste, which I was thankful for. Under the Old Dominick line, you have a bourbon, a Tennessee whiskey, a cast strength bourbon, and other variations within there. Those are the three that I was tasting, and I immediately thought, okay, between the Tennessee whiskey and the bourbon, got the same mash bill. I was same most things. Really, the one difference, as far as I understand it, would be the Tennessee whiskey is 5 proof points lower, so 2.5% ABV lower, plus Lincoln County process. So
The Tennessee whiskey is 75% corn, 13 rye, 12% malted barley, while the bourbon is that 52 corn, 44 rye. So the mash bills are
uh,
radically different.
okay, that makes more sense. I don't know why I had it in my notes that it was saying that would. Yeah, that doesn't make sense. That's a total.
Yeah.
Uh, my brain is going. Um, it's Anyway, the what
It's
I
it's the
thought
full
this,
moon. It's the full moon that's
it
doing it.
really
The
is.
upcoming
Yeah, with
full
the
moon
eclipse
is
coming.
just
Yeah.
eclipse all
Um,
of it.
yeah. Uh, I think probably what I was thinking instead was I was thinking of that comparison between doing the Huling Station versus Old Dominick, and what the bourbon, the 75% corn mash bill would look like from MGP versus the 75% corn that had gone through the Lincoln County process, and comparing those two. That's probably what I was thinking of. Um, so, do you do that kind of side by side to tell people, look, there are these things, or there are too many variables to really make that an apt comparison?
We haven't done a side by side like that yet because the healing that's out in the market is substantially older than what we're putting out in Memphis currently. And I just, that to me is not a fair fight
Yeah, sure.
or a fair example. I would love to, when we finally get to where the blends, the ages in the blends are similar, they're comparable to each other. I am so excited to be able to do those side by side.
And as a Kentuckian coming into Tennessee, having to learn about Lincoln County process and all that goes into it, obviously, your Lincoln County process is going to look different from Jack or George. Pritchard's being the only one that's grandfathered out of having to do
Yep,
that. Uh,
yep.
it seems that aside from defining it as, filtering through sugar maple charcoal, there's very little regulation in terms of what that process looks like. So, for comparison, at Jack, they've got the 10-foot deep charcoal. It takes like 2 days for the liquid to get from top to bottom. If you're doing Gentleman Jack, then they put it in another 3 feet afterwards, which to me takes out everything that's good about it. But that's just me. Um, and different distilleries have different depths, different ways to do it. Some kind of just rinse it through almost. So, uh, for you at Old Dominick, what did you envision, or how did you envision your Lincoln County process working, and for what purpose?
So for me, I'm definitely one of the ones that just kind of rinse it through the charcoal. Um, we go through about maybe a foot of charcoal, not much retention time at all. Just go straight from our spirit safe through the charcoal and into a holding tank before it goes into barrels. Um, and for me, it was kind of multiple reasons we went that route. I absolutely appreciate what the older distilleries do um, in the history behind their processes. But 10 feet of charcoal, that's a lot of space. 2 days, that's a lot of time. That's a lot of money. And as a craft distillery with very limited floor space, I don't have the space for it. I got to get the liquid in the barrels as quickly as possible. I can't have those disruptions in my workflow that would cause, and the additional cost of it. And so we knew we couldn't justify that. But also, I'm not about to try and compete with that. There's no point in competing with that. So I wanted to go almost the complete opposite of it and do a very small amount of charcoal, with the end goal of essentially creating a Tennessee whiskey for the bourbon drinker.
For me, that came across pretty well. I Lincoln County for me can go either way. It can be something that's very unique, but it can also just take out so many of those flavors that I like, because it is
Mhm.
leaching particularly oils out of the cast of the liquid rather. And I don't know, I'm very torn on it because I see the one behemoth that does it well and you still got tons of flavor, but at the same time, it just seems like it's stripping things out that you want to keep in there. So many flavors and congeners. So, um, to me, the Tennessee whiskey, even at 85 proof, which for me is low, uh,
Mhm.
fully admitted proof hound. Um, I am what I am, but for me it was low. So I'm not. I tried to go in without expectation when I was trying it, but it did have a really solid mouthfeel. The flavors were there. It didn't taste stripped down or watered down, which is honestly my worry when I see it, like a county process 85 proof. I worry about those things, but no, this was really quite well done. It was balanced. Um, the corn certainly came through, but it wasn't grainy at all. It still was mature. It was, I know the age stated as 4 years minimum. And it goes, you might go a little higher, close to five or uh,
Right now,
so,
we're a blend of like 4 to 6 at this point, almost
right.
about to introduce some 7-year-old to it.
Right. So, it's only going to get older. It, I assume you probably hit a point where everyone does, where it's like, okay, this is the good age. Beyond that, it gets a little too woody. And
Yeah.
um, as you were saying, with the Memphis heat and humidity, then you might hit that faster than you think. Uh, but I
Well, but
mean,
the
you
Memphis
probably thought about that.
heat, so the Memphis heat, I think, is why we're able to go to 85 proof and not be watered down. So we go in our barrel at 110 proof, so relatively low entry proof.
Mm,
Our batches are coming out anywhere from 118 to 128.
that's a
So we're
significant
gaining
increase.
a lot of proof. We're gaining a lot of proof in a relatively short amount of time. And so what that's doing is just it's removing all that water and giving you a really nice condensed, flavorful whiskey coming out of the barrel. Still have all those oils. And so it can hold up to that water addition and still be flavorful.
And with that, you're so you're adding water to parts of the process. The first one being you're coming off the still. Actually, I'll double check this with you because I have it in the notes that you come off the still at 130, but you said there was a different proof point from MGP. So just want to check. So right now it's
Yeah. So
130.
we're 130, 135.
Okay. So obviously adding water before um, barreling to get to the legal barreling all the way down to 110. And then at the end, when you're coming out at between 118, 124, 125, and you want to get down to 85, there's two proofing points. And I'm
Yeah.
curious, especially in the latter one, what your proofing process looks like. Do you slow proof, quick proof?
We're a relatively quick proof. Um, and it's just how we do it here from a space perspective. And so far, I've been happy with how it turns out. I admire the people who have the patience to do the super slow proofing.
It's yeah, I feel you on that. It's from a consumer perspective. I mean, most consumers are not going to necessarily notice the difference, which is a shame. But say Libby. But for a producer, it is a lot of time if you want to proof down by like half a gallon or quarter gallon a day or something. So I think the what I found or what I've tried to search for is when I hear people are quick proofing, I try to look for are there any soapy notes? Are you getting any saponification in the whiskey? Once or twice I have, not with these products, but for the most part, it seems like it works. It can work either way. I know. Look, MGP is doing quick proof, and they're putting
Yeah. Oh,
out.
yeah. They can't do slow proof.
They can't do slow proof. Um,
No.
I asked that question to Ian Sturzman once. I think we were talking about one of the Remus products, and he's like, "No, we just put the water in. It's fine." And, I was like, "Okay, so there must be something I'm missing where something happens to some products, and that product becomes saponified, but it's not a rule across the board. It's more the exception, it seems. So I gotta
Yeah.
I gotta go down that rabbit hole a little more.
That's a big rabbit hole.
Yeah. Uh, if you couldn't tell, I'm nerdy and sciencey, so I like those rabbit holes. So, uh, but so once you go into the barrels, I did want to shout out the first. Uh, so you use Tennessee white oak for your barrels. Sorry if that's right on the labels,
Yep.
which must be kind of nice. It adds an element of your own state terroir for it. Do
Yep.
you get to choose kind of where in Tennessee you get the white oak from?
We just specify West Tennessee. Beyond that, I let get all our barrels from Independence Day. I let them decide where in West Tennessee they come from. In the early days, when they first started working with MGP, it was actually right around the time of a barrel shortage. And so the wood for the first 1,000 barrels or so actually came, or all the ones for the first 2 runs of MGP and then the first 1,000 of ours here in Memphis actually was wood from Canale owned property, because they had a ton of timberland and had a lot of white oak. And so the cooperages couldn't get wood at the time, but had capacity because of that. And so because we supplied the wood, they would be able to make the barrels for us. And so it was out of necessity that we started with West Tennessee oak, and we decided to keep that going.
Like I said, it adds an element of locality, and if it's at least West Tennessee, I mean that to me counts. That counts enough because between the West and the East Tennessee, it's a very different terroir and climate that you're
Very
looking at as
different.
well. I'm also curious with being in Memphis, you're obviously right on the river. Um, this is a question I think that's only come up with one other company, and because they're Ingram, so they're on the
Yeah.
barge in the Mississippi. Do you get any what you would define as like terroir of the Mississippi getting into the barrels?
I hope not, given
that
given what the
was
Mississippi looks like regularly.
that was basically their answer too. It's like I hope not.
I hope
Muddiness,
not.
yeah.
Fortunately, we do get, because we do have the water. Yeah, we do have some really nice weather. We have breezes, so we do get benefit from being close to the river. But I really hope we don't get any Mississippi River characters in our whiskey.
With the warehouses, I know you. So you've grown warehouses now. I know you had to stop production for about a year and a half because it ran out of
Yeah,
space. Uh, so I hope that you're building warehouses as much as you need at this point.
we're in much better shape now.
Good to hear. If I saw correctly on the website, the websites, wow, the warehouses are palletized
Mhm.
as opposed to racking. Um, Definitely a choice. You can go either way with, and it be come out great. I'm just curious why you went with palletized.
The main driving factor, one, the aging loft that's on site. I really would not have been able to get very many ricks in it anyway from a height restriction. I don't even know if I could have gone 3 barrels tall with
Oh
it,
wow.
just because it's not a super high ceiling, plus the light and the fire sprinklers and things like that. But also, I was tasked with hiring as few employees as possible because we were mostly automated.
Hmm.
Rolling barrels requires labor. And so by palletizing, we're able to cut that down quite a bit. And it also makes it safer. Rolling a 500-pound barrel that doesn't want to roll straight and trying to get it in a rail and it not, go all cattywampus. You can have a lot of injuries that way. And so palletized was a way to also make it a little bit safer for my production team.
I'll go all cattywampus. That phrase has to have a story behind it because I have not heard
I,
that one before.
oh, you haven't heard cattywampus? I can't believe I even
No,
said it. My mom says it all the time, so I think that's probably where I picked up on it.
it's like that's either very Kentucky-ish, and I mean
And
that with no
maybe
disrespect.
it's Kentucky. Yeah.
It's either that or some obscure Lewis Carroll reference that I was like, that sounds like a character in the Jabberwocky.
Now
Uh,
I'm gonna have to look it up. But yes, my mom just says it, and I've
so
over the years have definitely become my mother. So
maybe she went a little cattywampus when she took you to Maker's Mark. I mean,
100%.
so anyway, just in our last 15 minutes or so, I did want to ask. Well, actually, first off, let's close out about Old Dominick. So again, we'll have tasting notes up for the Tennessee whiskey, the bourbon, and the cast strength bourbon, uh, all of which I really did enjoy. These definitely tasted different. It was not kind of the basic Kentucky bourbon flavor that we're used to at this point. It was definitely different, which I enjoyed. But as you're growing out the brand, I'm curious to what's up next for the consumer.
So the bourbons you tried were a very limited release in fall of 2023. And we did 4 unique batches, 90 proof, all in bond, and then 2 cask strength. And we've decided to release 2 of those 4, or 2 of the 3 really, if they're cask strength, permanent line extensions later in 2024. So that means be available in all of our markets, should always be available. So look forward to that. But we also do have that 83% wheat mash bill that we did at MGP. We do make it here in Memphis as well. Its wheat needs a little longer to age, so we're hoping it'll be ready next year, so 2025.
Awesome. And are you using a particular type of wheat? Um,
Just soft red winter wheat, so
Soft red
just
winter.
a nice easy wheat.
Oh, that's good. So yeah, I really appreciated getting to try these, and hope to get down to Memphis to try more in person. I know a few friends who have Huling Station line products as well, so I'll bug them for samples of things and try those as well. So I wanted to talk a little bit more towards the end about, you were president, as you mentioned earlier, you're president of the Tennessee Craft Distillers Guild, as well as just taking part in it as a member. And we, I don't often get to talk to people who are either in that role or have been in that role of leading a distillery guild and all the things that go along with it. So I'd love to just hear what your experience was like.
Oh, it's been fantastic. So I started getting involved with the guild in 2019. Up to that point, my president was kind of our representative there. Our Old Dominick's president was. Um, and it was actually later that year that I ended up on the board, and then in 2020 was elected president. And it's been so much fun because I've gotten to see the guild grow. Of course, I got to helm the ship as we all tried to get through the pandemic. And I'm very, very proud to say that all of our members survived. Some, a lot, thrived in it. So I was very, very proud to see that happen in Tennessee. Uh, but we've accomplished a lot. In my tenure as president, we've done less legislatively because my predecessor did a lot of the heavy lifting. We changed a lot of laws in the early years to where we have a lot of liberty as an industry in the state compared to other states. Whereas we've been focused in the last couple of years on growing the Tennessee Whiskey Trail and growing our support at the state level, getting the Department of Ag to help fund us, get Tennessee tourism to acknowledge that we are a huge economic driving factor in the state because they haven't always seen us that way. So that's been kind of my focus as president, is shifting the perception of spirits and whiskey in Tennessee and distilleries. We can be family friendly. We can be very supportive of our different cities, which we always, that's what we're all here for, is to support our hometowns. And it's just been a real pleasure being able to lead the group and just be a part of them.
And doing another callback to Drew's book, he mentioned how really the impetus for the book was that Kentucky has all this bourbon tourism, and people think of Kentucky when they think of bourbon. And Tennessee, basically apart from Jack, I would argue, not even including George, was really left by the side and overlooked by many people who were into whiskey, even by those who drank the products. And so I would love to hear that you're moving towards this idea of more whiskey tourism, bourbon tourism, whiskey tourism, Tennessee whiskey tourism, however you want to put it, coming to the state. I mean, one only needs to look north of the border to see the economic incentive for what happens when you have bourbonism and all the
Yep.
things doing in Louisville and Bardstown around just bourbon tourism. It would be a
Yeah.
huge
And
driver.
we did actually in 2023 pull the trigger on a tourism impact study that used 2022 data. And we do see what we're able to do because in 2022, the Tennessee Whiskey Trail welcomed 8 million visitors.
Wow.
So,
That's
and that's,
huge.
we've got a lot of different stops on the trail. So, it's spread across the state, which is amazing. But we definitely have now since then been able to show that we are a tourism driver. And we definitely look to our northern neighbors for inspiration and even motivation to keep pushing.
Absolutely. Add in certainly specific cities like Nashville being, I think it's the new like bridal shower capital of, or not bridal, bachelorette
Oh,
party capital.
Yes,
Spring capital. It's the Vegas of the East. It's become.
it is. It is.
Um, and look, it's still really fun. It was a lot of fun when I went down there last time. But you have so many people coming to the state for other reasons. If you get them to go to a few distilleries while they're there, stop over in Memphis too, get some good barbecue,
Yep.
and bring it over. Get some Gus's fried chicken too. Bring it over.
Absolutely.
To me, that's a hell of an incentive. So my last question for you, Alex, is, it says 13 years after joining Wild Turkey, and I'm not trying to date you here, I promise. It's 13 years after joining Wild Turkey through your time there at Pierce Lyons Reserve and Town Branch, or what is now Town Branch, and now at Old Dominick for going to your 9th year. What changes have you seen from your side of the industry that are the most exciting, and which are the most keep you up at night?
The most exciting changes have definitely been just how inclusive the industry has come, not just for those in it. I do think we've opened doors to be more inclusive as far as people working in the industry, but also seeing the consumer base evolve and become so much broader. It's no longer just a bunch of white dudes. It's grown, and also the consumer's gotten educated, which for me has made it more fun when I'm interacting with the consumer at tastings or events. So for me, that's been the most exciting change that I've seen over the years. The thing that keeps me up at night is probably more recent doing, and it's supply chain. I'm not gonna pandemic, man, that I think scared most of us, and definitely made us question if we were able to keep going. And it's settled down, but the supply chain is still problematic. And prices are going up, and for craft distilleries, that's not good. So that definitely is something that gives me heartburn.
Understood. Well, many hopes for the continued success of Old Dominick, continued growth at a pace where the supply chain can support you as well. And yeah, I hope to get down to Memphis and meet in person, and or next time you're up in New York too, have you meet in person too. With that, I think we'll close out. So hang out with me for just a sec after I stop recording. Thank you again to Alex Castle for joining us for this episode of the Whiskey Ring podcast. We will have tasting notes, links to the website where you can both look at and purchase bottles through there. Also information about social media links, all the good stuff to make sure you're following for all the new releases and the old releases that you still want to get from Old Dominick and Huling Station. So thanks again for listening. This has been another episode of the Whiskey Ring podcast, and I will see you next week. Hey folks, thanks for listening to another episode of the Whiskey Ring podcast. If you like what you hear, please go ahead and click that subscribe, follow, or like button. Leave a rating and review on your podcast app of choice, and let me know what you want to hear. You can reach out to me through the podcast apps or email me at david@whiskeyinmyweddingring.com with any suggestions or ideas for new show guests. You can also support the podcast at patreon.com/whiskeyinmyweddingring. That's whiskey with an E, for as little as $1 a month. $5 a month gets you access to bonus content, including our soon-to-resume Under the Influencer series, and $25 a month means you join the Barrel Share Club. Each month, Barrel Share Club members get to try products sent to me for review, bottles from my own collection, and sometimes bottles that I just pick up because they're fun or interesting. Right now, only 5 spots remain in the Barrel Share Club, so grab your place today. Finally, please follow on Instagram. You can follow me at Whiskey in My Wedding Ring or at Whiskey Ring Podcast. You can follow me on Twitter at Whiskey Ring. You can follow on Facebook at Whiskey in My Wedding Ring or join the Facebook group, the Whiskey Ringers group. And I hope to see you there. Cheers, thank you for the support, and see you next time.